Welcome back to Weekend Live. Well, joining me now live to discuss the week in politics is Ben Oquist from the Australia Institute and Kian Hussey from the Institute of Public Affairs. Hello to you both. Thank you for joining me.
Good afternoon.
It's been another very busy week. Let's border battle. It's certainly been a contentious topic over the last few days, starting, of course, after a Canberra woman wasn't allowed to attend the funeral of her father in Queensland. We know there's been a lot of criticism of the Queensland Premier and now the state's Chief Health Officer, Jeanette Young's handling of it. I just want to take you to a bit of audio today from the AMA Queensland President who came out in support of Miss Young.
We have seen a lot of quite personal attacks on our Chief Health Officer. She's a woman. She's very highly qualified. The stress is on her, and all we can say is back off. We think this Chief Health Officer is doing a great job. Of the Chief Health Officers in Australia, she is probably par excellence. She is probably the one they look up to the most, and leave her alone. She's doing a good job. We support what she's saying and doing.
Ben, we'll start with you. Given the criticism over the last few days, do you think that it is helpful for the AMA to come out to appear there to be playing the gender card, saying she's a woman? I mean, that doesn't seem like that's really got what to do with the actual story itself.
I think there's been some pretty nasty online abuse, and that's unfortunate wherever it occurs. Of course, we're allowed to have a good, strong, robust debate about what restrictions should be put in place, but it doesn't need to get personal and derogatory. And I think it's a shame that the debate has disintegrated in this way a little bit. Premiers, chief health officers are making the decisions in the best interests of their states and what they believe is a genuinely held belief of what is in the best interests of their states to protect their health and safety and ultimately their economic interests as well. That's not to say that mistakes haven't been made and there needs to be some more compassion in certain circumstances. But I think this idea that they're only acting in political interests and not in the interests of the health interests of their communities is wrong. It's a bit of a shame, if you ask me. In the early stages of this crisis, we're all in it together, and Scott Morrison was rightly praised for how he was handling it. But I think there's been a change from the federal government, really get stuck into the states as a bit of distraction for their own failings in some areas. It probably is working well for them politically. But I do think there's a bit of hypocrisy going around. I thought David Spears effectively speared Dutton on that this morning, when he's of course got restrictions that are causing all sorts of on the national borders that are causing all sorts of hardship problems for people either leaving or trying to come back. Yeah. And their assault on these is a bit of a distraction from them. Yeah. There are tough choices. We need to put some more humanity into places. Yeah, but I don't think it's fair to say that the premiers are somehow acting interests and not in the health interests of the community.
Yeah, I think you raise a good point that the derogatory comments are certainly not helpful, particularly during a pandemic, and there's a number of sensitive issues going on. Kian, what are your thoughts on this? Firstly, do you think that the AMA's comments in the broader context of this were helpful?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is the AMA, who are, part of the elites in Australia, are sticking up for the unelected bureaucratic elites, in this case Jeanette Young, who have been sticking up for the Hollywood elites, who, for the example with Tom Hanks, who was given an exemption to come into Queensland. What we're forgetting here is this is about Australians, this is about mainstream Australians who have been told, like you said, the woman from Canberra who wasn't allowed to come into Queensland and wasn't able to attend her father's funeral. And there's been countless examples of this kind of thing, people not being able to get access to proper medical treatment, members of their family. So what we have here is mainstream Australians on one hand who aren't being allowed to go into Queensland, and then we have the elites in the AMA sticking up for the elites in Jeanette Young, the unelected bureaucratic elites, who are looking out for other elite friends of theirs, like Tom Hanks. It's such a shame. We're not all in this together, and that's been the biggest lie throughout this whole coronavirus crisis. We aren't all in this together. We have the elites, the likes of the AMA and Jeanette Young, and then we have mainstream Australians who've suffered all of the job losses. Institute of Public Affairs research has shown that since March 14, 22,100 new public servants have been hired, while almost 600,000 private sector workers have lost their job. So I think this is just another example of that disconnect we're seeing here in the two Australias.
Yeah, and it's also been interesting to see, a number of federal politicians come, but I guess ultimately the decisions to the states themselves. I want to move on now and talk about Victoria. Today, the Premier Daniel Andrews announced a business package. He said it's one of the biggest packages to try and help the state out of its lockdown recovery. Ben, the Premier and the Prime Minister are going to be speaking this afternoon. Victoria will seek concessions from the federal government. Do you think that it is fair that almost Australia would have to help bail out Victoria?
I think all levels of government are going to have to do a lot more on the economic front. It's good that Dan Andrews has put a package on the table today. I hope he's talking to the Prime Minister about what sort of package he's putting on the table, not just for Victoria, but for the whole countries whose economy is suffering. UBS has calculated that the federal government is effectively going to be putting $57 billion less into the economy in the December quarter. This December fiscal cliff needs to be addressed. Otherwise, it won't just be Victorians that are suffering, it'll be the whole of Australia that suffers economically. We had the biggest drop in GDP ever in the June quarter, and now there's this $57 billion fiscal cliff. So Victoria's got to put in more money, but the federal government's got to put in more money. And this agenda about bringing tax cuts forwards isn't going to cut it. These tax cuts that go overwhelmingly to wealthy Australians, some 80% of the benefit of bringing forward stage 2 and 3 would flow to the top 20%. The bottom 50% would only get 3% of them. So they're really unfair tax cuts, and of course that means that they're more likely to be saved than spent, because wealthier people are more likely to save the money. So tax cuts aren't going to cut it. Yeah. We're going to need much more put in on the jobs and income support side. And the Australian Institute polling out today showed that people really don't support tax cuts. Only 20% of the population want those. Much more support for infrastructure, spending, income support, which makes more economic sense. So I think hopefully Dan Andrews and the Prime Minister are talking about that this afternoon.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, how much does the Commonwealth contribute now to help Victoria? In your opinion, Kian, we know that the JobKeeper payment, that's going to be changing come the end of this month. Do you think that there should be more concessional loans, I guess, for Victoria?
Well, I think before we talk about more support from the Commonwealth government, the most important thing that the Victorian government do, and the best stimulus they could give, is to allow businesses to open their doors again. We have businesses across Victoria that haven't had any income, thousands of businesses that haven't had any income since March this year. With this stimulus announced today is too little too late, really. When Dan Andrews first be going back into the lockdown, he should have had something ready to go then to show how he was going to support businesses. But instead, what we saw was a bit of a political mess where, for example, gardeners were told that they'd be allowed to work under the stage 4 restrictions. Yeah. And then when Dan Andrews made a mistake in his press conference and said that they wouldn't, the bureaucrats changed their advice and, put thousands of gardeners out of work. So the health risk of gardeners going to work didn't change. It was just the Premier made a mistake in his statement. So the most important thing is to let people get back to work where it's safe to do so. Institute of Public Affairs research has highlighted that by Christmas we're at risk of losing 810,000 businesses, and with them would be the loss of 1.7 million jobs. It's just a catastrophe, an economic catastrophe. Small businesses have suffered the brunt of the lockdown measures. Institute of Public was released yesterday, found that small business workers have lost their job. 377,000 small business workers lost their job between March and August. Meanwhile, only 30,900 big business workers lost their job. So the key thing here is to get small businesses open again, get Victorians back into work. And in many instances across the regions of Victoria, there haven't been coronavirus cases in quite some time.
Yes, well, hopefully maybe regional Victoria may soon be able to move forward with the different steps. It certainly seems to be what the Premier has already said. I just want to end talking about the New South Wales coalition crisis. Of course, this has been a very contentious clash over protection policy. Ben, what do you make of this? Today, Today, the New South Wales Minister David Elliott, he came out labelling the Nationals leader John Barilaro weak. Do you think that Mr Barilaro's position is untenable?
Well, I think the big winners are Gladys Berejiklian, Matt Keane, the Environment Minister, Rob Stokes, the Planning Minister. Barilaro has really strengthened the hand of those Liberals, those moderate Liberals, and strengthened the hand of the Premier in negotiations with the Nationals in the future. I think he's come out a very weakened figure. He's helped divide the coalition, which is obviously good for the opposition in New South Wales. But overall, it's Matt Keane, Gladys Berejiklian, Rob Stokes who are the political winners out of this. I don't know what it does for Barilaro's medium-term future and longer-term future, and whether he can stay on. But one knows he is very politically weakened, and the Liberals are strengthened in that coalition.
Kian, what are your thoughts? Politically, is John Barilaro now at a loss?
Well, there's always these kinds of politicking in the coalition. What's important here to keep in mind is that, you know, for mainstream Australians out there in the regions, I don't think they care too much who's leading one party or the other, or what clash of personalities they're having from one week to the next. John Barilaro here has raised a very important issue, and that's the growth of green tape for farmers out there in the regions. So farmers have been doing it tough already, and with the coronavirus crisis, things have been hard on them. What we need now is more jobs and not more green tape. So this is all about these koala protections. John Barilaro is raising a very important issue, and that is the extent of green tape that already exists, that already holds our farmers back. Institute of Public Affairs research has found that under the EPBC Act, the federal environmental legislation, regulation under that Act has increased by 445% since the year 2000. So that gives you some kind of insight into the growth that's happening here. And other IPA research has found that 7 of that Act has put at risk over $65 billion worth of investment since the year 2000 by allowing environmental groups to take projects to court. So the focus here shouldn't be on what's happening in the politics from day to day. It should be about farmers in the regions, green tape, and cutting that green tape to create the jobs that 1 million unemployed Australians so desperately need.
Ben, did you want to add to that?
Create jobs. Oh, it's just so silly to think that you're going to create millions of jobs by killing koalas. Those nonsense figures about how much jobs are being held up by sensible regulation. Everybody knows the koala habitat has been smashed by the bushfires, and more are going to be needed to protect them. And citing nonsense figures about how many jobs will be created by green tape doesn't do the public debate any good. Barilaro is weakened. We can protect koalas and have jobs in a sensible modern economy.
Well, as much as legislation has been very contentious this week, unfortunately we do have to leave it there. Ben and Kian Hussey, thank you for joining me this afternoon.